The rooster's crow pierced through the pre-dawn darkness of Dusty Creek, a forgotten settlement clinging to life in the heart of Arizona Territory, 1887. 16-year-old Mary Beth Sullivan jolted awake on her straw mattress, the familiar ache of hunger gnawing at her stomach. Through the cracked wooden walls of their one-room cabin, she could hear her father's labored coughing, a sound that had grown worse with each passing winter. "Pa's lungs ain't getting any better," she whispered to herself, pulling on her worn boots and faded dress. The Sullivan farm, if it could even be called that, consisted of 3 scraggly acres, a handful of chickens, 2 goats, and old Bessie, the sow who provided their only reliable income through her occasional litters. Mary Beth stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The sky was painted in deep purples and greys, with the first hints of gold creeping over the distant mesas. Dusty Creek lay silent below, its handful of buildings casting long shadows in the valley. The general store, the saloon, the sheriff's office, all controlled by Clayton Murdoch, the town's self-proclaimed business leader, who owned the railroad contract and most of the surrounding land. She made her way to the small pen behind their cabin, expecting to find old Bessie wallowing in the mud as usual. Instead, the gate hung open, squeaking in the morning breeze. "Bessie!" Mary Beth called out, panic rising in her chest. Losing their pig would mean losing their last chance at making enough money to pay Murdoch the overdue rent on their land. She scanned the area frantically, spotting hoofprints in the dirt leading toward the rocky hills beyond their property. Without hesitation, Mary Beth grabbed her father's old rope and began following the trail. The tracks led her past the Sullivan property line, up a winding path she'd never explored before. As she climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the first rays of sunlight began painting the landscape in brilliant oranges and golds. "Bessie, where in tarnation are you going?" she muttered, breathing heavily as the path grew steeper. The pig's tracks seemed purposeful, as if old Bessie knew exactly where she was headed. After nearly an hour of climbing, Mary Beth crested a small ridge and found herself overlooking a hidden valley she'd never seen before. Below, sheltered by towering red rocks, old Bessie stood near what appeared to be the remnants of an old mining operation, rusted equipment scattered around a partially collapsed mine shaft. "There you are, you stubborn old girl," Mary Beth called out, relief flooding through her. But as she made her way down into the valley, something caught her eye. The ground around where Bessie was rooting seemed different, disturbed, fresh. She approached cautiously, and her heart nearly stopped. There, partially unearthed by old Bessie's determined digging, was a wooden chest. Its brass corners gleamed despite years of being buried, and strange symbols were carved into its weathered surface. Mary Beth knelt beside the chest, her hands trembling as she brushed away the remaining dirt. It was heavy, much heavier than it should have been if it were empty. A rusty padlock secured the lid, but years of moisture had weakened the metal. With a sharp rock, she managed to break it open. The chest creaked as she lifted the lid, and Mary Beth gasped. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were dozens of official-looking documents, maps and land deeds. Her eyes widened as she recognized names and locations, including one that made her blood run cold. Sullivan Farm, Original Grant, 1863. "This can't be right," she whispered, pulling out the document with shaking hands. According to the deed, her family's land and most of the territory surrounding Dusty Creek had been legally granted to her grandfather, Thomas Sullivan, over 20 years ago. But that was impossible. Clayton Murdoch owned everything in these parts. Everyone knew that. As she continued searching through the papers, Mary Beth found correspondence between territorial officials, railroad companies, and Clayton Murdoch. The letters painted a picture of corruption, forged documents, and intimidation that went back decades. Her grandfather's legitimate claim to the land had been buried, literally and figuratively, while Murdoch built his empire on stolen ground. "Mary Beth!" Her father's voice echoed across the valley, distant but urgent. "Mary Beth, where are you, girl?" She quickly rewrapped the documents, closed the chest, and struggled to lift it. It was too heavy to carry alone. Making a quick decision, she reburied most of it, keeping only the deed to their farm and one particularly damning letter. She tied the documents inside her apron and called to old Bessie. "Come on, girl. We need to get home. Pa's probably worried sick." As they made their way back down the mountain, Mary Beth's mind raced. These documents could save her family's farm, but they could also get them all killed. Leighton Murdoch didn't become the most powerful man in the territory by playing fair, and he certainly wouldn't give up his empire without a fight. By the time she reached their cabin, her father was standing on the porch, relief evident on his weathered face. "There you are. I was about to organize a search party. Where'd you find Bessie?" "She wandered up into the hills, Pa. Just took me a while to track her down." Mary Beth tied old Bessie securely in her pen, her mind still reeling from her discovery. "Well, I'm just glad you're both safe. Come inside. Got some coffee brewing." As Mary Beth followed her father into their humble cabin, she felt the weight of the hidden documents against her ribs. Everything had changed in the span of a single morning. The question now wasn't whether she should act on what she'd found. It was whether she was brave enough to survive the consequences. Through their small window, she could see the sun, fully risen now, casting its light over Dusty Creek. In a few hours, the town would be bustling with activity. Clayton Murdoch would be making his rounds, collecting rents and tightening his grip on the community. The sheriff, Murdoch's bought-and-paid-for enforcer, would be patrolling the streets. None of them knew that a poor farmer's daughter had just uncovered the truth that could bring their whole corrupt system crashing down. Mary Beth poured herself a cup of her father's weak coffee and stared out at the town below. The real question now was, what was she going to do about it? The coffee tasted bitter in Mary Beth's mouth as she sat across from her father at their small wooden table. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, and she could hear the distant sounds of Dusty Creek coming to life, wagon wheels creaking, horses neighing, and the familiar clatter of the general store opening for business. "Pa," she began carefully, watching his tired face over the rim of her cup, "what happened to Grandpa Thomas's land? I mean, how did we end up with just these 3 acres? Her father's weathered hands paused around his coffee cup. A shadow crossed his face, the same expression he always wore when talk turned to family history. "Why are you asking about that old business, Mary Beth?" "Just curious, I suppose. Sometimes I wonder how things might have been different." Jacob Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes distant. "Your grandpa was a good man, came out here in '63 with a proper land grant from the territorial government, had papers and everything." He coughed, the sound rattling in his chest. "But when the railroad came through, things got complicated." "Complicated how?" "Clayton Murdoch arrived right around then, said he had legal claim to most of the territory, including our land. Had official-looking documents, lawyers from back east. When your grandpa tried to fight it..." Jacob's voice trailed off. "What happened, Pa?" "Found him dead in a ravine 3 days later. Horse supposedly spooked and threw him." Jacob's voice was barely above a whisper. "But Thomas was the best rider I ever knew. Never made sense to me." Mary Beth felt the documents hidden in her apron grow heavier. "And you never saw Grandpa's original papers?" Murdoch claimed they were forgeries. Said he'd have the sheriff arrest anyone who suggested otherwise. Jacob looked directly at his daughter. "That's when I learned to keep my head down and mouth shut. Sometimes survival means accepting what you can't change." Before Mary Beth could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look toward the window. 2 riders were coming up the path to their cabin. Sheriff Marcus Webb and one of Murdoch's hired men, a mean-looking cowboy everyone called Snake Rodriguez. "Stay inside," Jacob said, standing quickly. "And whatever happens, don't say nothing about what we just discussed." Mary Beth watched from the window as her father stepped onto the porch. Sheriff Webb was a large man with a permanent sneer and badge that seemed to gleam with the same cold light as his eyes. Snake Rodriguez stayed mounted, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Morning, Sullivan," Webb called out. "Mr. Murdoch sent us to discuss your rent situation. I told Murdoch's man last week I need another month. The chickens ain't been laying good, and that's the problem, Jake. You've been saying that for 3 months now." Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Murdoch's patience has limits. Look, Sheriff, I'm not trying to cause trouble, just need a little more time." Snake Rodriguez finally spoke, his voice like gravel. "Time's up, old man. You got until Sunday to come up with $50, or you and your daughter need to find somewhere else to live." $50, Jacob's voice cracked. "Last month it was 30. "Interest," Webb said with a cold smile. "Mr. Murdoch's been generous long enough." Mary Beth felt her hands clench into fists. The documents in her apron seemed to burn against her ribs. These men were stealing her family's land that legally belonged to them, and now they were demanding payment for the privilege of being robbed. "Sunday, Sullivan. Don't make us come back here again." Webb climbed back onto his horse. "And Jake, your daughter's getting to be a real pretty young woman. Be a shame if something happened to her because her daddy couldn't meet his obligations." The threat was clear, and Mary Beth saw her father's shoulders slump in defeat. After the men rode away, Jacob came back inside, looking older than his 52 years. "Pa, we can't what, Mary Beth? Fight the sheriff and Clayton Murdoch? With what army?" He slumped into his chair. "Maybe it's time we accepted reality. Maybe we should pack up and head to California like the Hendersons did." "No." The word came out stronger than Mary Beth intended. "This is our land, Pa. Our home. Our home for 3 more days, unless I can find $50 somewhere." Mary Beth made her decision. "Pa, what if I told you there was a way to fight back? What if I told you I found something that could prove this land belongs to us?" Jacob looked at his daughter with a mixture of hope and fear. "Mary Beth, what are you talking about?" She reached into her apron and carefully pulled out the deed and letter she'd taken from the chest. "When I was chasing Bessie this morning, I found something. Look at this." Jacob's eyes widened as he examined the documents. His hands shook as he read his father's name on the official land grant. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden in an old mine shaft up in the hills. There's more, Pa, lots more. Letters between Murdoch and territorial officials, maps, documents that prove he's been stealing land from families all across this territory." "Sweet Mother of God," Jacob whispered. "If these are real, they're real, Pa. I can see it in your eyes. You recognize Grandpa's signature." Jacob was quiet for several minutes, studying the papers. Finally, he looked up at his daughter. "Mary Beth, if these documents are legitimate, they're also a death sentence. You think Murdoch got where he is by letting people expose his crimes? So what do we do? Just let them steal our land and run us out of town?" "I don't know, darling. I honestly don't know." Mary Beth stood up, pacing to the window. Down in the valley, she could see the bustling activity of Dusty Creek. Somewhere down there was Clayton Murdoch, probably in his office above the general store, making plans to squeeze more money out of struggling families. Sheriff Webb would be making his rounds, ensuring everyone stayed in line. But there might be allies, too. She thought about the other families who'd been forced off their land, the small business owners who struggled under Murdoch's monopoly, the decent folks who whispered their complaints in private, but were too scared to speak up publicly. "Pa, what about Pastor Williams? You always said he was a good man." "He is, but Mary Beth, the church depends on donations from Murdoch. Pastor Williams got to be practical about where his bread's buttered." "What about Dr. Patterson? He treats everyone fairly, rich or poor." Jacob considered this. "Doc Patterson, maybe. He came from back east, has education, might know something about legal matters. But honey, even if he believed us, what could one doctor do against Murdoch's machine?" Mary Beth felt frustration building in her chest. "There has to be someone, Pa. Someone with authority who isn't bought and paid for." "There is," Jacob said quietly. Federal marshal comes through about once every few months, but Murdoch always knows when they're coming. Gets plenty of warning to clean up his act temporarily. When's the next one due? Could be weeks, could be months. And even then, Jacob shook his head. Mary Beth, I admire your courage, I truly do, but sometimes courage ain't enough. Mary Beth looked at her father, really looked at him. She saw a man who'd been beaten down by years of struggle, who'd learned to accept injustice as a fact of life. She loved him dearly, but she also knew she couldn't follow his path. Pa, I understand why you feel that way, but I can't just let them steal our home without a fight. Maybe you're right. Maybe courage ain't enough. But maybe it's a start. What are you planning to do? Mary Beth carefully folded the documents and put them back in her apron. First, I'm going to visit Dr. Patterson, see what he makes of these papers. Then, she paused, thinking, then I'm going to find out who else in this town might be ready to stop accepting what they've been told they can't change. Jacob stood up and put his hands on his daughter's shoulders. Mary Beth, promise me something. Promise me you won't do anything that'll get yourself hurt. I couldn't bear losing you too. I promise I'll be careful, Pa, but I can't promise I won't do anything. These documents prove Grandpa didn't die for nothing. He died because he was right. As Mary Beth prepared to leave for town, she felt the weight of decision settling on her young shoulders. In 3 days, they'd either have $50 they didn't have, or they'd be forced off land that legally belonged to them. But now, for the first time since her grandfather's death, the Sullivan family had something they hadn't possessed in over 20 years. Proof. The question was whether proof would be enough to overcome bullets, bribes, and the brutal machinery of corruption that had ruled Dusty Creek for far too long. Looking back at their small cabin, Mary Beth silently promised her grandfather's memory that his death wouldn't remain unavenged. Whatever it cost her, she was going to make sure the truth finally saw daylight. 3 months after Mary Beth's discovery, Dusty Creek was transformed. The morning sun now rose over a town where honest families could work their own land without fear, where the general store served all customers equally, and where the sheriff's badge meant protection rather than intimidation. Clayton Murdoch sat in a federal prison cell, awaiting trial for fraud, murder, and corruption. The chest Mary Beth found contained evidence of crimes spanning 2 decades, forged documents, bribed officials, and the systematic theft of dozens of family properties. When she finally convinced Dr. Patterson to examine the papers, he contacted the territorial governor, who sent federal marshals to investigate. Sheriff Webb had fled town the night before the marshals arrived, but Snake Rodriguez wasn't as smart. He was serving 5 years for extortion and assault. The Sullivan farm now encompassed its original 840 acres, as specified in Thomas Sullivan's authentic land grant. Jacob's cough had improved remarkably once they could afford proper medicine, and old Bessie had become something of a local celebrity, the pig who uncovered the corruption that had plagued their community. Mary Beth stood on the porch of their new, larger cabin, watching the sunrise paint the landscape in gold and crimson. Pastor Williams approached on horseback, carrying the week's mail and wearing the silver badge of Dusty Creek's newly elected sheriff, chosen by the townspeople in the territory's first honest election in 20 years. Morning, Mary Beth. Got a letter here for you from the territorial capital. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was an official appointment. Mary Beth Sullivan, Deputy Territorial Land Commissioner, age 17. The governor had created the position specifically for her, recognizing that someone who understood both the land and the people was needed to prevent future corruption. "Pa's going to be so proud," she whispered. "He should be," Pastor Williams smiled. "Takes real courage to stand up to evil, especially when you're standing alone." I wasn't alone," Mary Beth replied, thinking of Dr. Patterson's support, the testimonies from other victimized families, and most importantly, her father's quiet strength. Nobody ever really stands alone if they're fighting for what's right. As the sun climbed higher, Mary Beth could see other families working their restored lands. The Hendersons had returned from California, the Martinez family was rebuilding their burned-out homestead, and new settlers were arriving weekly, drawn by news of honest law enforcement. Old Bessie snorted contentedly in her pen, probably dreaming of the treats she'd receive from grateful townspeople for the rest of her days. Sometimes the smallest actions, following a wayward pig at dawn, could change everything. The truth had indeed set them free, but it had taken courage, persistence, and community to make that freedom real. Dusty Creek had learned that justice wasn't something that happened to them. It was something they had to create and protect together. Mary Beth pinned her new badge to her dress and headed toward town. There was work to be done.